Greetings, friends. I'm Vitaliy Portnikov. Volodymyr Zelensky has reported that the United States and the Russian Federation are discussing the signing of the so-called Dmitriev Pact, an economic agreement purportedly worth up to $12 trillion, which would include ambitious joint economic projects between the two countries. According to Zelensky, however, this agreement is also being linked to the issue of ending the Russian-Ukrainian war, in other words, to questions of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Zelensky has stated clearly that Ukraine will never accept an approach that ties a U.S.-Russia economic deal to decisions about Ukraine's sovereignty. If you think about it, though, there is nothing particularly sensational in the Ukrainian president's statement. The fact that figures such as Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have often placed financial interests, both those of the United States and their own, above considerations of morality or international law, should make such a development unsurprising. It is also worth remembering that Vladimir Putin appointed Kirill Dmitriev as his special representative for contacts with other countries, precisely so that Dmitriev would focus on economic discussions with Witkoff and Kushner, rather than on the broader political issues. In this context, the economic projects Putin is offering to Donald Trump can only strengthen the American president's desire to end the Russian-Ukrainian war as quickly as possible in order to move on to resolving economic questions. From this perspective, it is hardly surprising that Washington is seeking a settlement of the war within the coming months. Zelensky has confirmed reports that have already appeared in international media, noting that this urgency may also be connected to the U.S. election cycle. In my view, however, it is less about Trump's concern over electoral risks, including the possibility of Republican losses in Congress, and more about his desire to secure a rapid result and formalize economic agreements that the American and Russian sides could negotiate separately. It is also important that the United States does not appear to see European countries as participants who would guarantee Ukraine's security or monitor a potential ceasefire, if such a ceasefire were achieved. The Ukrainian president speaks instead about the United States, Ukraine, and Russia as the main parties responsible for monitoring such arrangements. This creates a paradox. On the one hand, Donald Trump repeatedly says that ending the Russian-Ukrainian war is primarily Europe's responsibility, and that Europeans must take care of their own security. On the other hand, when it comes to the practical mechanisms of that security, there seems to be no place for Europeans, neither at the negotiating table nor in the supervision of a potential ceasefire. From this point of view, appeals to European participation are useful for the U.S. president, mainly when responsibility for the lack of real agreements with Putin needs to be shifted onto European positions that allegedly hinder Trump's peace efforts. We must also understand another important point. Whenever Putin sees that his proposals provoke interest or even greed among members of Trump's inner circle and perhaps the American president himself, he begins to introduce new and increasingly serious conditions that, from his perspective, would ultimately undermine international law while strengthening his own position in negotiations with Washington. In this context, the issue of U.S. recognition of Russia's claim to Crimea has once again surfaced. Let me remind you that this idea has been present in the dialogue between Putin and Trump almost from the first days after Trump's return to the Oval Office. If the United States were to agree with this proposal and officially recognize the occupied and annexed Crimea as part of the Russian Federation, it would amount to the burial of international law carried out jointly by the presidents of the United States and Russia. It would mean accepting the principle that borders in Europe can be changed by force and then legitimized by the countries of the democratic world. Putin clearly understands that when discussions revolve around the mythical figure of $12 trillion, the temptation of such deals may cause the American president to lose interest in international law as well as the authority and credibility of the United States in favor of dubious political bargains. Volodymyr Zelensky stresses that Ukraine will never accept such an approach. At the same time, Russia may not demand that Ukraine recognize Crimea as Russian at the first stage. Instead, Moscow may seek recognition from the United States first, hoping that Washington will later pressure at least some of its allies to take similar steps. Countries of the so-called Global North might then follow the American lead, believing that such recognition would improve their relations not only with Putin but also with Trump himself. In that scenario, Putin would achieve not only a strategic victory over Ukraine, but also a blow to the entire world order that was formed after the Second World War. And that, in turn, would mean opening the door to a potential global conflict, a door pushed open jointly by the American and Russian presidents. This is what a so-called $12 trillion agreement between Russia and the United States could ultimately represent if it were accompanied by such political decisions from Washington. Thank you, friends. Stay with this channel, subscribe, follow my social networks, and use the YouTube sponsorship feature. May peace and victory be with you.